Today we have Jack Clough, our Grant Manager for the Tree Production Capital Grant, who I'll hand over to in a moment. There'll be a presentation of around 30 minutes, and then we'll move on to answer some of the questions that you've already submitted through to us. We'll try and cover any other questions that you send through in the chat at the end of this. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll add this to our YouTube channel and provide all attendees with a link so that you can watch it again. So I think that we will get started now. I will hand over to Jack.
Thank you, Gemma. I'll just attempt to share my screen. And you all see that okay? I've got nods from the presenters. Thank you. So thanks, Gemma, for the introduction, to everyone for joining the call today. For today's webinar on the Tree Production Capital Grant. My name is Jack Clough. I work for the Forestry Commission as a grant manager. In addition to the Tree Production Capital Grant, I also sit across the Tree Production Innovation Fund and Woods Intermanagement Forestry Innovation Funds. The presentation I'm about to give is divided into two sections, the first of which covers background and rationale for the grant, the levels of funding on offer and eligibility criteria. And the second section will then run through how to go about making an application, and I'll outline how we score applicants and explain what it is that evaluators will be looking for. At the end of the session, as Gemma's just mentioned, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, and I'll be answering all of the questions that you guys have submitted in advance of this presentation. So moving on. So about the Tree Production Capital Grant, and the TPCG is funded by the government's Nature for Climate Fund, and a substantial chunk of this has been earmarked to achieve the objectives of the England Trees Action Plan, or ETAP. The government has ambitions to substantially increase tree planting rates by the end of this Parliament, and to meet these targets domestically will require a corresponding increase in UK production of tree planting material. So the TPCG has therefore been developed in response to this challenge and aims to boost the capacity of the domestic tree production sector. What is the TPCG? It's a new 50% match funded capital grant administered by the Forestry Commission. It's funding to help tree nurseries and seed suppliers to invest in projects to improve, expand, automate or mechanise their operations. It's been designed to enable applicants to increase the quantity, quality, diversity and biosecurity of domestic supply. And it's been designed to complement the Tree Production Innovation Fund, which is another Forestry Commission grant with similar objectives, supporting research and development projects. So what funding is available through TPCG? We have almost 9 million in grant support that can be made available over the course of the next 3 years to support successful projects, with applicants awarded up to £175,000 in funding to cover up to 50% of project or equipment costs. To prevent the money from being hoovered up by lots of large bids, we've split the funding into two streams. Stream A for projects with a total value between £20,000 and £100,000, and Stream B for projects valued above £100,000. Projects need to have a minimum total cost of £20,000 to be eligible for funding, i.e. be applying for a £10,000 contribution from the TPCG. The maximum contribution that you could apply for from TPCG in any given round will be £175,000 for projects valued at £350,000 or more. So you could, in theory, apply for a £175,000 grant towards a £500,000 or £1 million project, but it would be capped at £175,000. And applicants may submit no more than one bid during each funding round. This slide gives an overview of eligible costs, so what the grant can and can't be used to pay for. Eligible costs include those for purchasing equipment and machinery, delivery and shipping costs for items, and staff costs associated with construction of expanded facilities or installation of items on your premises. Ineligible costs include funding for work that's already been carried out or will have been carried out before any grant agreement has been signed, in addition to ongoing maintenance costs for items or equipment and staff training costs and seed or sapling costs. We have had a few queries from potential applicants asking if the grant would cover the purchasing of land. Land is not specified as an ineligible cost, but you would need to put forward a very strong case for land acquisition in your application. Wherever possible, we'd really encourage applicants to use their own capitals to secure land and then apply to TPCG to support infrastructure or equipment to be built or used on said land. This slide gives a few examples of the kinds of projects that TPCG could support. It's by no means exhaustive. There'll be lots of items or projects eligible for funding that are not on this list. So projects could include purchases of intelligent transplanting systems to facilitate automation, improvements to production infrastructure and irrigation systems, and water treatment or refrigeration equipment to improve biosecurity. Eligibility. So to be eligible for funding under the TPCG, applicants must be UK based and will need to demonstrate how the grant will be used to increase English tree, seed or sapling supply. The reason behind the English supply specification is that the funding is derived from the Nature for Climate Fund in support of the England Trees Action Plan. Applicants from devolved authorities may apply, but will be required to clearly demonstrate in your application how the funding will be used to enhance seed or sapling supply to England specifically. Forestry England and Forest Research are not eligible for funding under the TPCG, and the bottom of this slide lists those who we suspect will be likely to apply. Again, this list is not exhaustive, so if you're not on this list, it doesn't mean that you're not eligible to apply. So that covers the grant scope and eligibility criteria. I'll now move on to how to go about actually making your application before taking questions and answering those that were pre-submitted. So this slide gives a high-level overview of how to apply. In short, you'll need to complete and submit 2 documents. And the first of these is an application form and the second is an associated finances spreadsheet. Forms are available on .gov at the link that's given on the slide here. And forms should be submitted to the Tree Production Capital Grant mailbox, also on the screen no later than 5 to midnight on the 30th of June. A single stage application process will be followed and all questions of the application form are mandatory. So if you do leave boxes blank, your application may be rejected. Please use the space provided. Okay, so the application form itself is made up of 9 parts. This sounds like a lot, but the majority are tick boxes, and I'll be walking you through the 3 more involved sections now. Part 1 of the form asks for a description of the project, so you should use this section to clearly outline what you would like to use the grant to purchase or develop. So it'd be helpful here if you can list the items you're seeking funding for. This is followed by a series of questions and checkboxes which will be used to make sure your project is eligible for funding. So as an example, the question for grant scope is given on the screen. So we'd expect applicants with eligible projects to be ticking yes. Part 2 of the application form forms the bulk of the application, so it asks 7 assessed questions, the responses to which will be reviewed by the TPCG evaluation panel. Each question has a 250-word limit, and as the grant has been designed specifically to boost sector capacity, the response to question 1 is given twice the weighting. So question 1 asks, what effect will the project have on your production capacity? And here you must be quantitative, providing an estimate for the number of additional saplings or quantity of seed that the project will enable you to produce annually. Question 2 asks what effect the project will have on the diversity of species you produce. So if you please be specific here and outline which species the project will support the production of. Question 3 asks how the project will affect the efficiency of your sapling production. So for example, it might reduce labour requirements or reduce reliance on inefficient processes. Question 4 asks what effect the project will have on your business or charity's resilience to disease, pests and climate. Or this could be additional operational resilience, securing your ability to supply seed and saplings. Question 5 is geared around value for money. So here we'd like applicants to outline how much the project or items will cost and explain how this represents good use of public money. The evaluation panel will also use your finances spreadsheet when reviewing your response to this question, and this should itemise the costs for project components. If your costings appear to be above the market value, the panel will advise FC to challenge applicants on this before awarding any agreement. It would be really appreciated if you could identify the source of any match funding in your application here, and any match funding should not be sourced from another government grant. Question 6 asks whether or not the proposals are sustainable. So the FC don't want to be supporting projects that are likely to have adverse environmental impacts. So it says on screen that machines with high consumption of fossil fuels are unlikely to be sustainable. And then last but not least, question 7 asks how the project will be managed. So here we're looking for reassurance that the organisation or project team have the relevant resource and experience to realise the benefits of any proposals. So here you can highlight your organisation's track record or project team member skills and experience. So how will the responses to these questions be scored? Responses will be scored on a scale of 0 to 4, with 0 being unacceptable and 4 being excellent. The definitions for each of these criteria are given on the screen. As I've mentioned, the score for question 1, capacity, will be doubled, giving this criterion a 25% weighting. Any application that scores 0 in response to a given question will be rejected, and proposals must score a minimum of 16 out of 32, so half of the available marks to be eligible for funding. So that's sort of an average of acceptable across the board. In support of your application, you will also be required to submit a TPCG finances spreadsheet. And in this sheet, you must specify the financial year in which you intend to make a claim. So claims can be made on receipt of your items or completion of projects, and invoices must be dated within the financial year specified on your spreadsheet. It's important to note that the Forestry Commission don't have the ability to transfer funding between financial years due to the way that government money is allocated. So if you specify that you would like to claim for an item in 22-23 on your finances spreadsheet, you would not be able to invoice and claim against a TPCG grant beyond March 2023. This slide contains a screenshot from the TPCG finance spreadsheet. There are 2 tables like this in the sheet, one for items to be purchased that you can see on screen, and another for other eligible costs like delivery of items or project work. In this table, you should input the year you intend to make a claim using the drop-down arrow. This will be either 2022/23 or 2023/24. For clarity, financial years run from the 1st of April to the 31st of March. Then once you've input the item and claim year, you can put in the total item cost and the amount you would like to apply for under the TPCG. The grant contribution will then automatically calculate a percentage in the right-hand column, and if this is more than 50%, the box will turn red instead of green. The total applied for in the bottom, so this green box towards the lower half of the slide, should not exceed 175,000, and again this box will turn red if that's the case. All successful applicants will be required to complete a post-implementation report of the project within 3 to 6 months of claim, and a template for this report will be provided by the FC. The full terms and conditions for this grant are available online at the TPCG application webpage. Please note that funding decisions may be conditional on the outcome of a physical inspection by the FC. The reasoning for this is just to make sure that proposals for a given site are sensible and appropriate. Payment of the grant will be made by BACS transfer following receipt of claim forms. The FC will provide successful applicants with claim forms. Applicants will be eligible to submit claims following receipt of the items involved in the project, and claims must be supported by evidence of spend. So in practice, this would be invoices or timesheets for projects involving staff. Confidentiality. If any of the information in your application is commercially sensitive, please do make this clear to the panel when submitting your forms. So we're moving on to some questions. So these were submitted by hopefully those on this call ahead of the presentation. We will have an opportunity for additional questions. If you have these, please do put them in the chat. First question, is the fund open to lower level local authorities and wildlife groups, and is there a minimum area size? The answer being yes, the TPCG is open to local authorities and wildlife groups, and there's no minimum area size to be eligible for funding. I've briefly touched on whether the grant would cover the purchasing of land. This applicant also asked what's the minimum number of trees grown per annum required. There's no specific requirement for number of trees to be produced per annum. However, you will need to demonstrate or estimate on application how the funding will increase your production capacity. Third question, are tree nurseries who grow and supply the ornamental amenity sector eligible for this grant? So FC's grant giving powers are limited to species with forestry potential, so this can be broadly interpreted to cover most trees. Nurseries in the amenity or ornamental sector are eligible to apply, but would score more highly against the evaluation criteria if looking to diversify into forest nursery production. The way in which the evaluation process has been set up will favour producers of larger numbers of trees, which will typically be forest nurseries or similar. Question 4, is creating new seed storage facilities within scope? What capital costs towards establishing a new seed? Would capital costs towards establishing a new seed orchard be eligible? Yes, facilities for storing tree seed would fall within grant scope. And yes, you may apply for costs towards the establishment of seed orchards. You'd need to demonstrate on application specifically how the storage facilities and orchards will be used to supply England. Question 5, are there organic standards in natural soil biology? So for this one, there are no specific standards that need to be met to make proposals eligible. However, sustainability of bids will be evaluated, as I've touched on. Demonstrating that industry standards will be met or exceeded would likely strengthen your application. We're not completely clear on what this question was asking, so if I've not quite covered it, feel free to pop something in the chat or do contact the TPCG mailbox. Question 6 asks if there are any restrictions on how the money can be spent, e.g. training for existing staff or recruitment or apprenticeships. So I've run through the eligible spend criteria, so training falls out of scope, unfortunately. A full list of the criteria is given both in this presentation and is also available on .gov. If you do have personnel costs relating to construction or implementation of items purchased, then that would qualify as eligible spend. Question 7 asks if the grant is suitable for smaller community-based projects, or is it geared towards larger organisations? Yes, the grant is definitely suitable for smaller community-based projects. We have 2 funding streams on offer, Stream A and Stream B, with Stream A being geared towards smaller proposals with a minimum total value of 20,000 and a maximum value of 100,000. Question 8. What other funding sources can and can't be used as match funding for this grant? So funding from other government grants, as I've mentioned, must not be used as match funding. We've got 6 more questions. So will the FC be offering off-take agreements for the extra production of saplings to applicants? No, the FC will not be providing off-take agreements. Will there be further rounds of funding? Yes, there will. The Tree Production Capital Grant is scheduled to run until 2025 and will reopen for applications in 2023 and then again in 2024. 11, can community tree nurseries apply? Yes, we would absolutely encourage community tree nurseries to apply to this grant. Question 12, Whilst the application documents describe polytunnel infrastructure, would it also cover the polytunnels themselves? Yes, you may use TPCG funding to contribute towards the purchasing of polytunnels and other capital items. Question 13. A proportion of our annual tree sales are used for urban planting schemes such as community orchards and new development landscaping. The actual quantity varies year to year. Would this mean we are eligible for the new scheme? So yes, you would be eligible to apply, but as I've mentioned in response to one of the above questions, the evaluation process will favour producers of larger numbers of trees, which will typically be forest nurseries. And finally, question 14, additional funding of asset, can projects be financed for the remaining 50%, and are stage payments to suppliers paid by grant prior to completion? So assuming by finance you mean by bank loan, then yes, this would be permissible at the discretion or risk of the applicant, and payments are made on receipt of items or completion of works, and any claims must be supported by evidence of spend, so in practice invoices and timesheets. So what happens next? So on the 30th of June, the Tree Production Capital Grant application deadline will be upon us, so you'll need to submit applications to tpcg at forestrycommission.gov.uk before this date. In July 2022, the TPCG evaluation panel is scheduled to review applications, and they will then make recommendations of projects to fund to the FC. And then by the 10th of August, we will aim to have outcome letters and grant agreements issued. So that marks the end of the presentation, so you might get a break from my voice. So we can move on to Q&As. Faye or Gemma, would you be able to read those out if we've had any from the chat?
Yeah, no problem, Jack. We've published as many of the questions as we can. Some of them were already covered by the other questions. If people have got questions that we don't manage to get to, you can always email the tpcg at forestrycommission.gov.uk email address, and we'll try and get back to you on those questions. So one of the first questions that we had was, is this similar to some agricultural capital grants where you have to buy all items listed in the submission or the application becomes invalid?
I don't think the application would become invalid, but you'd only be able to make claims for anything that you've paid for. I don't know, Indy, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would just say for us to understand what our spend will be, it's obviously important that we know that what you put in your submission will be bought. So yeah, I would strongly encourage anyone to only put down items that they are certain they will go on to purchase.
Yeah, it could potentially prevent other applicants from having projects funded if you're putting in for things that you're unlikely to actually spend the money on.
Okay, so the next question, does personnel costs extend to contractors' labour costs for installation of equipment?
Yes, yes it would.
Thank you. Somebody's asked a question to do with apple trees. So they understand from a nurseryman that apple trees must be grafted to pre-establishing root ball. Does this procedure count as planting? I understand that there's a national dearth of both apple orchard and qualified nurserymen able to do this grafting. So this funding would be well received.
What I would say to that is that if you can demonstrate that the funding will result in the production of trees, whether that's grafting or planting, then yes, that would be acceptable. So I think, yes, if you can show that the items funded will allow more apple trees to be grafted, that would be completely fine.
Thank you. The next question, is a building project eligible for this fund?
Yes, provided the building project is infrastructure that will enable you to increase your nursery or seed supply capacity.
Thank you. If the project covers 2 years, do we have to claim for the whole project at once, or as stated in the spreadsheet, over 2 years, i.e. we will claim 40% in year 1 and 60% in year 2?
Yeah, that would be absolutely fine, as long as the 40% that you want to claim in year one, you've earmarked using your finance spreadsheet. Essentially, as long as we know when you're spending the money and when you'll be making claims, and we'll have those items and be able to demonstrate invoices, that will be absolutely fine.
Thank you. Are landowners looking to create a tree nursery eligible for this grant?
Yes, you would be eligible for this grant.
Lovely, thank you. Next question is, how do we evidence match funding? For example, supply of our own mill timber for construction of store, workshop, trestles, etc., which would be a substantial component of our match.
So if your match funding in terms of items rather than money itself, I think it'd be quite hard to quantify. Have you got any thoughts on that, Indy?
No, not really. I think that is a tricky one. Some evidence that you have other funding sources is obviously useful, if you can put that down.
Okay, thank you. Plant healthy registration, FRM registration, or plant passports, are these required?
They're not a requirement of this. Sorry, my phone started talking to me. I don't think they're a specific requirement of this fund, as in we won't be auditing this fund of those specific things, but where they're required, we expect applicants to be passporting and registering FRM material.
Thank you. A question about whether the funding's retrospective. Do we need to spend the money first out of our own funds and then ask to be reimbursed? It's quite difficult for smaller organisations.
Yes, you would unfortunately need to spend the money and then be reimbursed because the grant's paid in arrears. Yeah, it's just a nature of the way in which the grant's been set up.
Thank you. There's a question. Is this purely about volume increases? As a grower of large trees, volume is relatively low, but improving the quality for urban forestry planting is key to our development.
Yeah, so it's not just about quantity. It's, as I've mentioned in the presentation, about quantity, quality, diversity and biosecurity. So large trees would fall within scope, but there is some weighting towards capacity because of the that's one of the main objectives of the grant. I don't know if Indy, have you got anything to add to that? Or...
No, I think you've covered that. Yeah.
Thank you. There are a few more questions that we haven't published yet, so I'll just work through some of those. When will the decision on applications be made and the applicants notified? So
the decision on applications will be made. And if I go back to the previous slide, am I still showing my slides, Gemma? Yeah. So when we issue outcome letters, that's when you'll know whether you're successful or unsuccessful. So we'll aim for the 10th of August. It could be possibly a week later if we, depending when the panel can meet. But that's the date we'll be working towards.
Thank you. We're buying land and ownership should be transferred in September. Can we apply for the grant even though we don't own the land yet?
I don't see why you couldn't apply for the grant, but we'd probably want to see some confidence that that will come about and that the project funding will be used. Indy, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I think we would view that as a project risk, and that would be evaluated as part of the bid. So if you can provide strong evidence that this purchase will go ahead, then that will be in your favour.
Thanks, Indy.
Thank you. Does this grant support a startup project?
So yes, it could fund a startup project, assuming that startup project is something like a nursery. I'm not quite sure what the applicant means. It might be one to maybe send through to the mailbox and we can give you some specific guidance.
Thanks, Jack. Will the approval be for a whole programme or project, or can individual aspects of the programme be approved and other parts rejected?
That would be at the discretion of the panel. We'll aim to approve applications in full where they're appropriate, but if the panel feel that certain aspects of a project aren't appropriate use of government money, then we could come back and negotiate and say that we'd like to fund this aspect, but not this.
Okay, thank you. Given the short application window, how accurate do initial quotes need to be when submitting the proposal?
So we wouldn't, as accurate as possible, ideally. So the quotes that you give will be embedded into any grant agreement that we then issue. So those finance spreadsheets will be used as your spend profiles, as your budgets in effect. So yeah, if you could get as close to the true figures as possible, that would be really helpful.
And then there's another question that kind of follows on for that as well. Just due to prices for the cost of materials or equipment may increase before the grant is approved, is there any scope of contingency within the application for this?
I don't think there is scope for contingency within the application. Indy, have you got any thoughts on that one?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate that that's an issue, but I don't think it's within our power to, factor in inflation and other such things, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think given that the grant is should be opening again next year, if you would prefer to submit next year, then that would also be fine. And then you could get perhaps truer reflection of the costs for materials at that given time. But yeah, I appreciate it's not an ideal scenario.
Thank you. Can a claim be for updating existing infrastructure?
Yes, it can be, as long as you can demonstrate that the answers to the 7 questions meet the eligibility criteria.
Thank you. Can you please clarify what is meant by English seed? Is this seed sourced within England from English suppliers or only seed of English provenance?
So by English, I don't think we'd specify that the grant has to be only used on English seed. It could be seed sourced from elsewhere that's then used to supply England. The focus is on where that seed will then end up. So it could be that you've got seed from more northerly provenances that will then be used to plant in England. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right, Jack. Yeah, so it's about the ultimate destination of the seed, because we're tied to the Nature for Climate programme and the England Trees Action Plan. This is about where the final product ends up. So that could be seed from anywhere.
Thank you. Could you go into some more detail on what you define as increasing your capacity of production? Do we detail in the application what we could increase the capacity in the following year, or detail the total amount of trees we could produce in year 5 using the same funded piece of machinery?
I think if you could do both, that would be great, or give as much information on how it will increase your capacity in both the short to medium and also long term, would be of interest to the panel.
Thank you. To clarify, we must show how our planting enables production of more trees to be eligible to use this for tree planting projects.
Sorry, could you repeat that one, Gemma?
To clarify, we must show how our planting enables production of more trees to be eligible to use this for tree planting projects.
I think the answers to that is yes. Indy, if you...
Yeah, you need to demonstrate how your use of the grant will allow you to increase the number of trees you produce or the volume of seed.
Thank you. Can crowdfunding be a match funding source?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Yeah.
How many quotes are required for any project to succeed?
By quotes, do they mean quotes for equipment before they then give estimates? I'm not quite sure on that. Do you know what they mean by that, Indy?
Not really.
Might be one to send through to the mailbox.
Yes, send through. If there's anything that we maybe need a bit more information for to answer, if you could send through to the mailbox, that would be great. Thank you. Are we okay to submit an application now for a project to commence in 2023, or do we need to wait and apply in a 2023 round?
No, you can apply now for a project that will begin in 2023, as long as you state that that's the year you'd like the funding in your finance spreadsheet. That's absolutely fine.
Okay. Do you have a minimum lease requirement for funding buildings, unlikely to buy land but could lease it?
I don't think we do have a requirement. unless Indy's got any thoughts on that one, we might have to go away and think about it.
Yeah, I think we might need to think about that one.
Yeah, could you put that in an email and send it through to the TPCG mailbox, and we'll get back to you with a written response.
Is this grant just for nurseries, or can it be used for biodiverse woodland creation?
So it would need to link to tree or seed production rather than just woodland creation. Anything to add on that one, Indy?
No, I agree with that. There are other funds that would be more appropriate for woodland creation. This is primarily for nurseries and seed suppliers.
Is it correct that a project will fail if not completed within the original year specified on the finance spreadsheet? If so, would it be sensible to specify the following year?
Yeah, so you'd want to specify the year in which you're confident that you will either receive the items, complete the project, and have your invoices dated in. So for audit purposes, we'll need to have invoices dated in the financial year in which you have got your grant agreement for, basically.
Thank you. We're just going to do a couple more questions and then we will wrap up. Oh, somebody had asked, they said, sorry if they've missed it, but can salary costs be covered under the fund?
Provided those salary costs are being used to implement the items or to construct things on your premises, yes, but salary costs for day-to-day running of the equipment or nursery would not fall in scope.
Will we be able to include the cost of saplings produced with the TPCG in future ELM funded options, or will this be considered to be double funding?
Be considered double funding. Indy, have you got any thoughts on that one?
So is the question asking whether the fund can be used for saplings, the production of saplings that are also going through ELM, and then probably no is the answer, right?
Yeah, I think that one's a no.
Thank you. So would capital expenditures such as landform and digger work be eligible for the grant?
Yes, as long as they're being used for infrastructure, yeah.
And then I think that we will end on this question. So can funding be used for second-hand equipment?
Yes, I don't see why I couldn't use it for second-hand equipment, as long as you can demonstrate that it will increase your nursery's capacity or seed supply capacity.
Lovely. Just a couple of things that I can cover off here. Somebody's asked where they can find the spreadsheet. I'm presuming you mean the finance spreadsheet. It's on the gov.uk page. What we'll do is we can reply to individuals on some of these more specific questions through the live event Q&A. And then if anybody's got anything that needed further clarification, or if we didn't get to your question, if you could email through to the tpcg@forestrycommission.gov.uk email address, we'll get back to you on that. Jack, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, nothing further from me, but just thanks to everyone for attending and for all your questions.
Brilliant. I think we'll end it there then for everybody. We'll be adding the recording of the webinar to our YouTube channel, and we'll send around a link to everybody who participated today. So thank you very much for everybody, and thank you for your questions. Thank you, Jack, for your presentation.
Thanks, Gemma.